Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So, carbon tax and clean energy are, topical all the time, but even more topical in the last couple of days as we've heard the Premier of Ontario talking about axe the tax, and certainly the leader of the official opposition, the leader of the Conservative Party, also similarly doing that. And yet, at the same time, lots of people think that a carbon tax is one of the most efficient ways to actually get people to reduce their carbon footprint and potentially solve climate change. I saw a really interesting article, a column in the paper by Trevor Melanson. Is that correct? Melanson?
Melanson, yeah, you got it.
Melanson, I
Yeah.
apologize. Trevor Melanson, who is the Director of Communications at Clean Energy Canada. He's also a former journalist. And it was a really interesting opinion piece that he talked about where he said that on carbon tax, Justin Trudeau's job is indeed to be popular. Why has he got to be popular?
Well, because he's the Prime Minister of Canada. It's pretty high up in the job description, I would say. Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things we've learned or perhaps should have already known is that politics does matter. We live in a democratic society. And so even if something is fantastic and well thought out under the hood, it still needs to resonate and make sense for Canadians. And, I think a lot of people have this idea in their minds that the Liberal Party is a party that invests a lot in communications, but they feel that perhaps they don't always deliver on stuff. And the ironic thing there is that at least when it comes to climate policy, it's really been the opposite. I mean, this government has, implemented a lot of, I would say, very thoroughly thought out climate measures that are doing a lot of heavy lifting to actually achieve our climate targets. And they've done a really poor job communicating them. So in this case, it's a case of lots of substance and poor communications. And so with the carbon price, we're in a situation right now where people don't really understand it very well. And I think that is underpinning one of the things that's underpinning, the fact that most people aren't as persuaded as they could be that it is an important climate policy, which it is.
And so, what's your argument? Is that because the government hasn't done a good job selling it, because the Prime Minister is not popular, it's losing its potential to be implemented?
Well, obviously, the leader of the opposition is spending quite a bit of time repeating, three words, axe the tax. So, I don't want to put this all on the shoulders of the Prime Minister. Obviously, certain folks, like I said, the leader of the opposition and certain premiers have made it a point of going after it politically and drawing attention to it. I think, the Liberal government succeeded in a noble way in terms of actually doing what you would want a government to do to address climate change. And I think what they didn't do well enough was communicate it. And I think that is a failure. I mean, just Justin Trudeau recently said, "It's not my job to be popular." And that line made headlines. I imagine he knew it would make headlines. But it is his job to be popular, right? The fact that, carbon pricing isn't understood, people don't quite know how it works. They don't really quite understand this idea that, wait, okay, so I pay a little bit toward a carbon price, and then I get a rebate back. And so I don't quite understand how that works. Very quickly, how it works is that basically if something that is more climate change causing emissions in it costs a little bit more than something that has less climate change carbon emissions, you're more likely to gravitate toward the thing that costs less because the carbon price on it is smaller. And then the rebate you get back is the same size no matter what you paid in the carbon price. So the rebate has no bearing on what's called a price signal, which is where the carbon price works. And basically, it creates a more competitive field for clean options. So, by doing that, it can make them more available and more affordable. So it's a very it's a wise mechanism to shift our entire economy in this direction. And the fact that people get their money back means it doesn't really do harm to people either. But that's kind of a hard thing to communicate. And they really should have been spending years, whether it's sending out, quarterly pamphlets or something. They just didn't embark on a public education campaign. And here we are. And basically the leader of the opposition is the person who they're hearing from talk about the carbon price as opposed to the government. And so that's the mental model. That's the story people have in their minds, one created by the opposition, not by the government itself. That's a problem.
So let's take a step back. Do you think that a carbon tax actually makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fact. It does work. I mean, the policy has been not only modeled, but it's succeeded in the real world. In BC, it has worked. BC's had the longest carbon tax on the continent, and we know it's reduced emissions. We know it's reduced emissions elsewhere. Sweden has had one for a long time. So both historical analysis and modeling shows that it does drive down emissions. And the idea of a carbon price is that it's not prescriptive in what it tells you need to do to lower emissions. It basically, like I said, it puts in a price signal. And so businesses, individuals, industries will find the lowest cost way of avoiding paying that carbon price, even if they are getting some money back, because like I said, the money they're getting back is the same regardless. And in doing that, the idea, economists will tell you, is that will reduce emissions at a cheaper cost than anything else we could do.
Why at a cheaper cost?
It's that flexibility, right? So if I say, you need to do this one thing, like, okay, you're a business and I'm telling you, okay, here's what you need to do to reduce your emissions. And I give you one option. Or I say, look, we're going to introduce this carbon price and we're not going to tell you how to reduce emissions. And you're a business, so you're going to find the cheapest way to do that. So the carbon price is basically, it's taking that second route across the entire economy. Does that make sense?
I think to start with, you've got to have an attitude that climate change is a real issue and that we need to take some measures to solve climate change and reduce carbon. So that's got to be the entry point to this discussion, I guess, first of all. And then the question is, what's the better way to do it? By red tape and regulation, or through a price mechanism like a carbon tax? And there are some people that have argued that some regulation might make sense. And I guess the Conservative Party is suggesting, which I think is a little bit strange since they've always been the party that's not been for red tape and regulation, but they're suggesting that some sort of regulatory process is the better way to do this than the price mechanism. What type of regulatory thing could you put in place that would have a similar dampening impact on demand for carbon? It would be that you're not allowed to use it, period, or you're only allowed to use so much of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, a few things. First of all, I mean, I'm not sure what the Conservative Party of Canada's climate plan is. They haven't really clearly spelled that out yet. So I think that's a question mark, and Canadians should ask that question and expect a good answer before the 2025 election. The federal government does do a combination of carbon pricing and regulations and incentives. So the truth is the federal government is actually taking an all of the above approach. The carbon price, both the consumer carbon price and the industrial carbon price do a lot of heavy lifting, but so do a number of other climate measures, including the forthcoming oil and gas emissions cap is going to be a big one. There's ones targeting methane. There's a clean fuel regulation for transportation emissions. There are incentives. There's obviously the requirements for automakers to sell more EVs out to 2035. And then I said there are incentives, so investments in their clean tax investments that they're making, and as well. So, and then obviously the federal EV rebates that people have been getting for a few years. They're the Greener Homes Grant and energy efficiency. I'm saying all of this, and I'm getting most people listening and have just never even heard of this stuff. And I guess that was the point I'm trying to make, is the federal government actually has this really complex suite of climate policies that have gone through like tons of stakeholder reviews. They're thought out, they're nuanced, and most people haven't heard of it. But they're hidden. Stitched together.
They're hidden, right? That's the positive from a political standpoint, but the negative from actually an influencing behavior standpoint. They're hidden, and it comes back to, and I want to talk to you a little bit about this after the break, if we could, the GST and this issue of popularity, because the old provincial sales taxes that all provinces had were typically were hidden, and you didn't see it, and it was embedded in the manufacturing price of something. And the GST made things obvious, and when it was harmonized to make it the HST, it became very obvious to everyone. And And there's some positiveness to that, that you know how much you're paying in tax, but there's a negativeness of it. You say, I'm paying this much in tax. So there's both a positive and negative. One of the things that the provincial government in Toronto, in Ontario, have done is they put little stickers on all the gas tanks to show people every time they pump up for gas how much they're paying in tax, to make it non-hidden, to show people how much they're paying in tax. And there's a negative to that, and there's a positive to that. The positive is people are hopefully going to use less gas and less carbon emissions. The negative is that they're going to get upset that they're paying that much in tax.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That is the challenge of politics.
So I'm going to come back after a message. I'm going to ask you a question about Brian Mulroney, because this weekend, Brian Mulroney's funeral. I chatted with him at one point in time, and he said the things that he was that he was the proudest about were the things that were the least popular. Anyway, we're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes and talk about your column, popularity, and what a leader's job is to do. Stay with us, everybody. This is going to be an interesting conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Trevor Melanson is my guest tonight. He is with an organization called the Clean Energy Canada. He's the director of communications there. He's a former journalist, and he's written a really interesting article recently in the Globe and Mail, an opinion piece that said, on the carbon tax, Justin Trudeau's job is indeed to be popular. And I guess I want to challenge you about that for a second, Trevor, if I could, because I think you're right, but I want to challenge you for a minute. As I mentioned, I sat down with Brian Mulroney, the former Prime Minister of Canada, at one point in time. We saw his funeral this past weekend, and he told me that the things he was proudest about were free trade, but I almost lost an election, Brian, and the GST, but Stephen Harper took out 2 points of it, and I went down to only 2 seats because people were so upset about it. But he said that free trade changed the economy of Canada forever, and the productivity and prosperity of Canada forever was the smartest thing that he's done from an economic standpoint, that Canada's done from an economic standpoint, he said. And he said the GST is going to change, and did change, the financial situation of Canada forever. And the dumbest thing he thought that his successor, Stephen Harper, did was cut it by 2 points. And he says Stephen Harper was dumb by making that reduction, but he was popular. I was smart by putting in the GST, but I was unpopular and went down from the largest majority in Canadian history to only 2 seats. So I ask you, is the job of a prime minister to do what is the right thing for the Canadian economy, the Canadian environment, or is it to be popular?
Well, I would say it's both, which is probably why it's the hardest job in the country. Because it's often hard to do both, and few politicians can nail it, and nobody can nail it 100% of the time. I think that's, a great thing that Brian Mulroney said. And one can imagine that Justin Trudeau is having similar thoughts at the moment, because he's been in power for 8 years. And I would think, and I'm not in his head, but I would think when, you've been in power for the prime minister of a country for 8 years, that you are thinking about your legacy, as opposed to Pierre Poilievre, who's thinking about, what do I need to do to become the prime minister, and then I'll start thinking about what I want to do once I'm in power. Trudeau, of course, I'm sure his legacy is on his mind, and so that is important. And of course, we hope that we elect people that are looking out for our interests. At the same time, climate policy doesn't need to just be designed well to achieve its outcome at a low cost. It also needs to pass the sort of political durability test, which is to say that the carbon price especially does most of its heavy lifting in the years to come. So if it doesn't last, then it won't have achieved very much. It'll have achieved something, but its survival is probably the most important aspect of it of all. So, I mean, I think that's why, these sound like they're two different things, politics and sort of policy. But one can't live without the other. And that's why it's so, I think, it's so hard to be an elected official in this country or any democratic country.
Okay, so you may be too young to remember when Stéphane Dion, the leader of the Liberal Party and what was it? I can't remember now, 2008 or something like that, launched a campaign on the green shift, which was a carbon tax. And the Conservatives attacked him and called it the green shaft, and destroyed Stéphane Dion and his policy in a very short time period. So it's a well-worn strategy for the Conservative Party to attack it. What could Stéphane Dion have done differently with the green shift? What could Justin Trudeau, Freudian slip there, I apologize. What could Justin Trudeau do today with the carbon tax to better sell it?
Yeah. I think that, Justin Trudeau's living in a different time than Stéphane Dion. I think that we're very aware of climate change in a way that we weren't back then. It was still an intellectual idea to most people. It's gone from something that was abstract to something that is tangible and felt. I say this as someone who does a lot of public opinion research into this. And one of the things that really resonates, and this has been true over the past few years, is when you talk to a group of people about climate change, people tell personal anecdotes about, if you're in Ontario riding their motorcycle in January, if you're in BC, it's the wildfire smoke, or the fact that, the ski season kind of didn't really take off this past year.
It was one weekend, I understand. That was it, one weekend.
Yeah. And our entire wine industry is, the year, they're going to have an atrociously bad year. There's so many examples of how it's reshaping our country, and not for the better. So we live in a different time, right? Climate change is not abstract anymore. It's felt. Climate solutions as well are not theories for the future. They're, right in front of us. You see EVs drive down the road all the time. Your friends are installing heat pumps, or maybe you are. So the technology, obviously, wind and solar energy have gotten really cost efficient and have really been scaling up incredibly fast all over the world. So both the feeling the impacts of climate change have come to the fore for Canadians, and the solutions as well are visible. So we're living in a very different time than we were 15 years ago. So the question is, how does Justin Trudeau win people over on climate policy? I think it's important to emphasize that this isn't all about the carbon tax. The federal government has done a lot of things on climate, and they add up to a package of policies that are designed to reduce Canada's emissions by about 40% by 2030. And studies show that they're pretty close to being on track.
It's not all the other package that are being attacked. It acts the tax that's being attacked.
I guess part of my issue there is that frame is being defined by the opposition, right? My point, I guess, is that the Liberals aren't telling the story. So they're on the defensive right now, and they should be on the offense. They should be telling Canadians, look at all the things we're doing, look at what we're achieving. What's the official opposition's plan? Because people do care about climate change. So that I can say in confidence, people do want action on climate change, but they also have a sense of hopelessness about it. And they're uncertain what this federal government's actually doing. They need to hear, and they need to understand that this federal government is doing something, and they need to recognize when another party is not. So I think that this federal government needs to do a few things on the carbon price. One, they need to explain it better for people so they have a clear sense of how it works. I also think they need to be a bit more aggressive and assertive in talking about climate policy and demanding of people who are trying to get in their way, well, what's your plan? What are you going to do? Why are we having to shoulder all of this, right? Canadians care about climate change. The people in your province care about climate change. You're criticizing me, but what's your plan, right? Like, the Liberals need to say that more. They need to go on the aggressive. They're turtling too much. They're too defensive, and they're letting their opponents tell the story. They need to flip the script.
We've had different measures using the tax system to try to create incentives for people or disincentives for people to do things. Cigarette taxes, alcohol taxes, and incentives for using transit and things like that. Why is it, for some reason, that we haven't had this negativity about cigarette taxes or alcohol taxes, and we have on the carbon tax?
Well, most people don't smoke, whereas everybody pays, a carbon tax. So, I think it's something that affects everybody versus something that affects the minority of people. Obviously, more people drink. A lot of people probably don't realize that or at least don't actively think about the fact that alcohol is taxed. It's not as
One of the most
visible.
taxed commodities around, is it not?
Hmm?
It's
Oh,
one
it's
of the most
extremely
taxed
highly taxed. But they're not thinking about it. When you go to, maybe you do, but when I go to the liquor store and buy a bottle of wine, it doesn't even cross my mind that, this is heavily taxed and marked up. It's just nobody's talking about it, right? There isn't a politician going out there every day saying axe the alcohol tax. So it's just not, as you were saying earlier, it's just not front of mind. And I think that people also, it's a little more intuitive to people that like, drinking, okay, yeah, drinking is bad for us. We shouldn't do
But
it
if
too much.
using carbon is bad
It
and we
is.
want to diminish the use of carbon and incentivize people to use better ways of heating, of power, of consuming, etc., that uses less carbon, it's sort of like a alcohol tax or a cigarette tax, like a sin tax, is it not?
Yeah, it is a syntax in a way. I think that people don't, again, they don't always maybe have a clear idea of how it's working for them, or maybe a clear idea of what they could do differently. It requires people to like think through, okay, what kind of vehicle can I get? How can I lower my emissions? And some people may not feel ready to make those decisions yet. And they will be eventually. There'll come a time where it's time to replace your vehicle or your heating system or something like that. A lot of people aren't aware of some of the programs that are available to help make that stuff more affordable as well. So it's definitely more daunting and difficult for people to think, how do I avoid paying this? Than it is on like an alcohol tax where it's clearly, well, you just shouldn't drink as much alcohol, right? Like it's a pretty simple solution there. It's a lot more complex for people to think through, how can I avoid paying the carbon tax and adjusting your not even your lifestyle very much, but just sort of the things that you said, the vehicles that you drive, the way that you move around a place, your home. It's not drastic change, but it's subtle stuff. And you do need to think through it. And you do need to do some research to figure out what your options are, what government programs are available to help you out. But it's important to remind people that, like, there is a rebate if you're under the federal carbon tax, and there's a rural top up as well, because people in rural areas might say, well, we live in larger houses and we need bigger trucks. And so we're paying more in the carbon tax, which is why there's a rural top up to sort of account for that fact. So it is really important to emphasize that the Liberals, this federal policy is designed in such a way so that you do get the rebate, so it takes the sting off while still keeping that price signal in place. So when it's time for you to make a switch, you have a stronger incentive to do that. But yeah, that's a lot more complex than just, maybe don't buy that much alcohol.
It's interesting though, because what it does is it actually gives people more freedom to make the choice. They can choose to use more carbon if they want. They can choose to drive a Ford 150 truck and burn a lot more gasoline if they choose. And it's just giving them that disincentive, rather than California, which is just saying no internal combustion engines by 2030 or whatever it is. And so it's you got a choice. You either have a blanket red tape regulatory process and cap on something, or you give people an incentive. And so I don't understand, or disincentive. I don't understand why there is, number one, so much opposition, and number two, such difficulty in explaining it. Anyway, we're going to take a break for a message, and I'm going to come back and ask you why the Conservatives particularly would be against this, because I think this is sort of a free enterprise, more conservative-oriented way of accomplishing a societal objective. And originally it was the conservative parties, both in Canada and the Republican Party in the United States, that promoted a carbon tax as the solution to climate change. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Trevor Melanson. He's written a really interesting column in the Globe and Mail recently in regards to being popular, the Prime Minister, that he's not, and he should be, particularly in relevance to climate change and the carbon tax. Trevor, your organization is all about climate change. Tell me about your organization a little bit, if you could.
Well, yeah, sure. Clean Energy Canada, we're a national think tank. We've got staff and mostly in Ontario and BC. And, basically we advise governments of all parties, both provincial and federal, on the best climate policies out there. And we do a lot of research as well into showing, for example, how many jobs are going to exist in the clean energy sector, or how much an EV is going to save you, or the emissions reductions of certain climate actions as well. So we do research, we advise governments and stakeholders, and we speak to media as well. So we're really just trying to kind of raise the understanding of climate policies and the benefits of them as well across the country.
You got an interesting background with UBC's official newspaper, student newspaper, and then a reporter at the Globe and Mail, and then a professor at Humber College, and then some time with with Canadian Business Magazine, BC Business Magazine, Vancouver Magazine, etc. Before you came to Clean Energy. Why the move from journalism to public relations, communications with a think tank?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was mostly a positive thing. Like, it was a job I wanted, but obviously the journalism industry has been a tough one to be in for the past 20 years. So there was certainly that aspect of it. But I didn't want to go just anywhere. I didn't necessarily want to do communications for something I didn't care about. In this case, I don't feel like I left much behind in terms of what we're arguing for is something that I, entirely believe in, and we don't say anything that isn't true. So it feels a lot like being a journalist, except more focused on a singular issue, which also allows you to get a better understanding of that issue.
So I want to come back to this idea of the carbon tax effectively being something that I would have intuitively thought that, frankly, people on the right would have understood better and appreciated more, and was a policy recommendation originally from the Conservative Party of Canada and the Republican Party in the United States, that thought that something that was working through the free market system, through the basic supply and demand that we all learn in Economics 101 or whatever course we took in high school on economics, tells us is one of the best and most powerful and easiest and quickest ways to actually incentivize or disincentivize someone to do something. If something becomes more expensive, we'll use less of it. It's the basic, as price goes up, demand goes down. So if it's and particularly when you compare it to what the alternative would be, if you want to accomplish the same objective, you've got to put in some sort of regulatory restrictions or quotas or caps or something like that. The system of this cap and trade system that people have talked about. And you think about carbon tax being difficult to explain. A cap and trade system is terrible. Difficult to explain how you actually have a free market to trade emission caps and things like that. So tell me, why would the Conservative Party and conservative thinking people in Canada and the United States be so against a price mechanism?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll give a little BC history, actually. So, I mentioned earlier that BC introduced North America's first carbon tax. You're in Ontario here, so it may be surprising that the Liberal Party of BC, they renamed recently to to a different party name, but they actually introduced the carbon tax.
And the Liberal Party of BC is really the Conservative Party, correct?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, kind of. They're
it's a right-wing party. It's not a left-wing party. It's a right-wing party.
It's a right-of-center party. So a right-of-center party under Gordon Campbell, he had kind of an awakening, and he introduced a carbon tax in BC. And guess who opposed it? The NDP. The NDP ran an Axe the Tax campaign, really alienated the environmental community, who they considered their historical allies, and lost against the Liberals. And then, of course, after that, it flipped. And now we have an NDP party in the province that's, much more pro-climate under Premier David Eby than any of the other parties, perhaps excluding the Green Party. So now that's totally flipped. The NDP are definitely carrying the banner of climate action in the province, but it was introduced by a right-of-center politician, first one in North America. So absolutely, it is, in theory, a classically conservative idea But that depends. How do you think politics works these days? Does it stem from kind of ideologically consistent positioning, or does it stem from politics? And I think the answer to your question is it's all about politics. I think it's seeing that,
So are you telling me that politicians don't actually have principles? They don't stand for something and want to move forward with the things that they think are right for the economy. All they want to do is win power.
I think it probably depends on the politician. And I think, most probably having both ingredients in them. I think, I think many of them have good intentions and also still need to play the game if they want to win. But yeah, on carbon pricing, like it's not coming from I mean, it depends what you think conservative means, but it's not coming from the sense of, well, we need to do something about climate change. What's the most conservative thing to do? Because obviously that is. And I think a helpful way of thinking about this is that there is no free option here. And even the PBO has said that, it's carbon price or it's some other climate policy or it's doing nothing. And doing nothing has a massive price. Of course, the cost of climate change, the social cost of climate change is going to be huge, let alone sort of the competitive disadvantages of not keeping up with our allies and all of that. So there's no free option here. I mean, we just need to start from an honest place. And an honest place is we're dealing with catastrophic climate change. Doing nothing is the worst option of all and definitely not free. And so we want to do something. And economists are telling us carbon pricing is the lowest cost way of doing something. It's not the only way of doing something. We may want to do multiple things because we're trying to achieve multiple objectives. But that's a really good card to have in your deck because it is the lowest cost way to drive down emissions. So yeah, it is conservative in that sense, but I don't know that politics functions on those lines very clearly anymore.
It's the lowest cost. I think it also, and people have studied this, has the ability to have an impact quicker than anything else because the price mechanism, people start making choices right away if things become more expensive and choose to either consume less of that or to switch to something else that has a lower price associated with it and or not because they're willing to pay for the convenience of using that. And so if they wanted to drive a larger SUV or truck that consumes a lot more gas and so therefore has a lot more carbon tax associated with it, they've got the right to do that. They just have to realize that they're going to be paying more tax on that. And so it has an impact more quickly. It has more freedom associated with it. It adjusts, I think, more quickly over time as people come up with better solutions, like taking carbon out of whatever it is, the product. And if you think about a regulatory process, where if you had to apply that I've come up with this thing that has less carbon, and so I want to get some better quota system or some other thing from the government, it'll take a while. Versus a price mechanism, it happens sort of right away. So I think it's faster, it's effectively freer. It works through the basic supply and demand economy that we function in, the free enterprise capitalist economy that we function in, and it's not hidden. And I think that is a cost and a benefit. The fact that it is not hidden, that you can see it, and that it's gone up and that it actually hurts, is good because that you're paying that because of the carbon portion of whatever the product is that you're consuming. The negative is that you can see it, and so therefore politicians can run on X the tax and become unpopular. So come back to my first question to you, if I could. You think about Brian Mulroney, and he's being heralded, and I think justifiably so. And free trade he ran on in the 1988 federal election, and he almost lost for a while. The polls showed that both the Liberals and the NDP were gaining power, and John Turner, was criticizing him as being a sellout for the country. And yet, I think today most people would say, free trade took a bunch of adjustment, but it was the smartest thing that Canada's ever done for its economy. The GST, hated at the time. He went from the largest majority in Canadian history to 8 years later, only 2 seats, and primarily because of the implementation of the GST. And then a conservative successor, Stephen Harper, took away 2 points of the GST and was heralded as, fantastic and wonderful. And yet a lot of economic people, a lot of fiscal people think that, Brian Mulroney was brilliant and Stephen Harper was a bad economic manager, bad business manager, bad dumb move by taking out the 2 points, and has harmed our system dramatically, our fiscal system dramatically because of that. So I come back to, if Brian Mulroney did those two very smart things and became very unpopular because of it, does leader want to be unpopular or do the right thing? Sorry, be popular or do the right thing?
A leader hopes he doesn't have to make that choice.
But don't leaders have to do it on a fairly frequent basis?
Well, usually when they're going into an election that could crush them, they need to start focusing a bit more on the popularity side, because especially if the person who wants to defeat them intends to undo all of those things, or many of them, who knows, but certainly the carbon price. That much is very clear. Yeah, it's, look, I think one difference between the GST and the carbon price is in 20 years, you ask people, was it GST being higher the right thing? And I think you'd still get divided opinions because people probably won't ever arrive at a sort of strong majority opinion on how high taxes should be, generally speaking. But you ask people in 20 years, was Justin Trudeau right to stand by these policies? And I think you're going to get a pretty strong majority of people saying, yeah, because we're really going to be feeling climate change in 20 years. And the prime minister who fought and who knows, maybe loses over climate policy, probably is not going to look bad in 20 years.
So your advice is double down and fight for why and how this makes sense.
Well, I don't know if I'd use the word double down. I think I would just say, my advice is to, it's not doubling down implies that they're communicating this perfectly right now and they just need to do more of it. I think they need to tell a better story. I think
that's doubling down. That's re-emphasizing. That's
sure. If that's
doing it all over again.
I need to debate doubling down, but yeah, they need to, in communications, we call things a sword or a shield issue. And basically a sword issue is something that you want to be talking about because you think it's a strength of yours and your opponent is going to be on the defensive. A shield issue is something where you're spending a lot of time defending yourself and your opponent is attacking you. So climate should be a sword issue for this government, and it has been in the past, but right now in the carbon tax, it feels very much like a shield. And because it's a shield, Pierre Poilievre and certain premiers are setting the stage for what the discussion is going to be. And, the prime minister is talking about, why a carbon price is the most efficient way to cut climate pollution. And yeah, they got to say that, they do, but they need to spend a lot more time going on the offensive, they need to stitch together a clear vision for what they're running on in 2025. They need to empathize more with how climate change is impacting Canadians, because it is, and they're the party that's doing the most to deal with it. So they really need to, I think, take advantage of that emotional connection that people would have between what we're experiencing in this country and a government that's trying to do something about it. They need to tell that story better. They need to be more aggressive with their opponents, and they need to raise awareness, not just of the carbon price, but of everything they're doing. People need to have a clear sense of what this collection of measures equals in an election context. They need a clearer story on climate, sure, on affordability and the economy and other things as well. All these things are related, of course, but they need to have a better story. They need to be more aggressive, and and people need to understand carbon pricing better as well. Sure.
You were telling me that younger people are less worried about climate than older people right now, and that you were surprised by that, and you thought that maybe it was because affordability has become such an issue for younger people. Is that true?
Sort of. So there was this poll that we were looking at recently, and what we saw was that if I just asked you, do you care about this climate issue? Do you support it? Usually younger demographics, it's not huge, but usually younger demographics will be a little more supportive of climate action. And that's what we saw in certain poll questions. But there was this other question, which was, tell us, what are your top 3 issues right now? Going into election, what are the top 3 things? So you're limited to 3 things. And affordability and the cost of housing were listed on that. So if you're 30, the odds of you selecting those two things are extremely high. And so there just isn't much space to like fit in climate change into your top three. Whereas if you're, we saw among people who are 55 plus, we're actually more likely to put climate change in their top three, even though we saw that they were a little less supportive of climate action, generally speaking. So what we see, I think, is people who are a bit older and, again, on average, more financially secure. I know many people, that's not true for many people. I'm speaking in generalities here. On average, are more financially secure, are able to put climate change kind of higher in the list, sort of their mental priority list. So we have an issue right now where so many young people, of course, are, and people of all ages, of course, are struggling with the high cost of living, the high cost of housing. And so for them, climate change is something they care about, but it's just, they just almost can't even, they're so focused on this one issue right now. So inflation's coming down, and people need to understand the links between climate action and affordability as well. Actually, one thing we see, there's an international study from the International Energy Agency that shows that advanced economies like Canada actually see people spending less money on energy if we are to cut our emissions faster. There's a Canadian study as well, and this makes a lot of sense. You pay more for electricity because everything gets electrified, but when you're not paying anything on fossil fuels, and also we make things more energy efficient because that's part of this as well, energy costs actually go down over time. So it is important, I think, for people to see that big picture, to understand that story of actually this transition, fossil fuels, long-term, you know, they're kind of a wasteful way of spending money, right? Doing things more efficiently, doing things on electricity is actually going to lower energy bills, in addition to the fact that it fights climate change, which is going to lower the cost of climate change. So that there is a linkage there, and I don't think it's super well understood, and that's something the government needs to obviously tell better as well.
Trevor, this has been an interesting conversation. I really appreciate it. We're going to take a final break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with some concluding comments with Trevor and his column on that Trudeau's got to be popular, and he's not popular today. And on one policy particularly, this carbon tax, and Trevor thinks that he needs to do a better sell job, get out there, and I think double down. That's the words I used. But Trevor talks about just doing a better job in communicating the benefits of the carbon tax. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Trevor Melanson. He is the Director of Communications at an organization called Clean Energy Canada. It's a think tank across Canada that's dealing with climate change. He's written a really interesting article in the Globe and Mail, a column in the Globe and Mail that I read just a little while ago that talked about Trudeau and his popularity or lack thereof, particularly relevant to this issue about climate change and carbon tax and the conservative position on axe the tax. And I guess, Trevor, your argument is that Trudeau's got to try harder to be popular and sell the carbon tax at the same time. So I'm going to ask you about this sort of principles versus politics discussion that we were having. You know, what's the use of having political capital if you're not going to actually use it? What's the use of being a leader, of being prime minister, if you're not going to actually do something good? Like, is it just to have power? Or do you actually want to do something and use your political capital, use your leadership, use your position to do something that you think is actually right for the country? And I use as the example, Brian Mulroney, GST, free trade, you know, Beach Lake, which he didn't win, Charlottetown, which he didn't win, but things that he thought that were critically important, versus Stephen Harper cut 2 points in the GST, which a lot of people think have harmed our fiscal situation, or Pierre Poilievre maybe destroying the best chance that we've got to put in place a carbon tax that's going to help our carbon situation. What do you think the job of a leader is?
Well, I think, you know, of course, it's what you said. The job of a leader is to, well, I would say a party and a government is more than one person as well, right? You've got ministers who are leaders in their ministries and their files, a number of elected officials and non-elected government workers as well. Let's not it's not a one man or one woman show. And so a leader, as in the Prime Minister of Canada, I mean, Justin Trudeau, now he's passionate about climate change. You know, he knows the file well. He likes talking about it. I really think he believes in it. But he didn't sit down and write all these climate policies together, right? So, you know, for him, his job isn't just to write policy. His job is to be the face of the party. He's the prime minister. His job is to win people over. Yes, it's to stand for what's right. It's to stand for what's good. And on climate file, he is doing that. But as prime minister on a team of many people, his role is to try to make it more popular, 100%.
So it comes back to, I think he's got to double down on it. He's got to not run away from it. He's got to turn it into a sword. Stop letting it be a shield, to use your analogy.
Yeah, they've got to turn it into a sword. People care about this issue. In, you know, the 2019 election, if you recall that one a few years ago, that was when Greta Thunberg was taken off, and climate felt front and center. It felt like people were voting on that issue. That was when Andrew Scheer was running up against him, and it feels like it helped them win. You know, so right now it doesn't feel like, it feels like we're both feeling climate change even more and talking about climate policy even less. I mean, we're talking about the carbon tax, but we're not talking about climate ambition. We're not talking about doing the right thing, making sure that we're going to make Canada a safer place to live, a place where we can live long term, and that we're doing our part, you know, among our international peers to fight a problem that we're all a part of. You know, some people say, oh, Canada's too small. That is total BS. There are 195 countries in the world and we're like 10th in terms of our carbon emissions in the entire world. So if Canada is too small to matter, guess what? 185 countries are also too small to matter, and we don't solve climate change. Canada is not too small to matter. Our emissions matter. And we can also be a leader around the world. Countries do look at what Canada and even what provinces have done, and they take those policies and they try them at home, and they make a difference there as well. So climate leadership and doing what we need to do to protect our way of life. This isn't about radically changing how we live. An EV isn't so different from driving a gas car. Remember, fighting climate change is about protecting our way of life. It's about keeping that pond frozen so you can still play hockey on it. What's more Canadian than that? You know, that is a story they need to be telling. And that is an idea that needs to get front and center on people's minds again. It's not right now, but in 2025, it needs to be.
Trevor, I have an outdoor rink in a park in behind my house. It did not freeze over once this year. This is the first time I've lived in this house for 24 years. This is the first time I've ever remembered that it didn't freeze over even once. And, you know, the ski hills were devastated this year. Some people liked it. They didn't have to shovel snow as often as they would normally. I do think that climate change is the challenge of our generation, and maybe affordability, as you point out, is a short-term big challenge we have, and I think it is. I think particularly housing affordability, but affordability generally, I think, is being solved as inflation comes down. But housing affordability certainly hasn't as of yet. I think is really a major issue, and is one of the real negatives between generations, and that the high net worth that my generation has enjoyed has created a block to entry into the housing market for your generation probably, which I think is a major issue. But climate change is the issue for our generation, for our society, and it dramatically impacts the next generation. And that fact that we could leave a world that is far less inhabitable, if frankly not inhabitable at all, to maybe not the next generation, but a few generations from now, I think it's something that we should be really ashamed of and motivated to change. And I firmly believe that a carbon tax is one of the best ways to do that. I think it is the easiest, the fastest, the one with the least friction and red tape and regulation associated with it. I think it's been proven worldwide to work. I think every economist that studied it says it works. I had the privilege as part of a doctorate in business that I did to study a little mini thesis on the topic, and came to the conclusion that it was by far the right strategy and the best way to implement actions against climate change. And the alternative of red tape regulation caps and quotas and things like that are heavy-handed government ways of putting in place restrictions. I don't think they work, and if they do work, they're a far heavier-handed way. The only benefit of it is you don't see it as well. The one negative and benefit of this strategy is that you see it. And so when you see it, you can attack it like you could free trade, like you could the GST, but it's the right thing to do. And I think that we need politicians that show leadership, that see that climate is a major issue, that see that the carbon tax is the best way to solve it, and that use their political capital and their leadership to do what's right. And I don't see a lot of people doing it, and I wish they would. And I think that you're right, that Justin Trudeau has got to use his popularity and his political capital to, I would say, double down. You would say use the policy as a sword, not a shield, and get out there and argue for why it's right, because it is right. And all those politicians that have turtled and have not shown courage, I think are making a mistake that history will judge them poorly on. Anyway, that's my point of view, and that's our show for tonight. Thank you, Trevor, for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Vancouver, BC, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are up on social media and on YouTube the second that my show goes to air. Thanks, everybody. Good night.